Hi, I'm Chris Cooper-Bland. I work for an organisation called Endava, who does primarily nearshore development for financial services and also digital media. I worked for them for quite a few years. Generally, I get involved in doing either architecture consultancy in sort of financial services payment space, and I've also worked for a number of client-side organisations before that, again doing architecture on, I'd say, sort of quite important financial systems. So I used to work for UK banks, who pay all your salary, all of those in the UK, so that's generally deemed to be quite an important organisation. And I currently head up the architecture function at Endava. So I thought I'd like to talk to you a little bit about decision making in IT architecture. In a lot of the projects I've been working on, it's either not done very well, not documented very well, or decisions keep being challenged, and the blame spreads. That's never a good thing. So what I'm going to cover in this session is really talk a little bit about bad decisions, why decisions are bad. Is architecture, is the essence of architecture really about making decisions? I'm not going to dwell too much on that. A little bit about the scope of the decision making or decisions you have to make within projects. This can be at any level, at the sort of enterprise architecture, right down to decisions that affect single pieces of code. Cover a little bit about decision-making process and some of the techniques I've found useful in projects that I work on, what influences decisions, and then validating your decisions, and Q&A as well, of course. One thing I'd like to say before we start, this is an interactive session. I can't talk for 90 minutes. I'll run out of things to say. So this is all about sharing your views, really, because they're as valid as mine, and I've got some particular spots in for discussions. If you've got any questions or ideas or thoughts about any of the slides, just put your hands up and we'll cover them then. I had a message which I will deliver now or I will forget. Please don't forget the drinks reception in the main hall at 5:30 because the sponsors would love to see you. And everybody deserves a drink. So, bad decisions. What makes a bad decision? We all make mistakes, and that's part of life. Mistakes happen, but decisions, we really should be able to get those right if we think about it enough, follow the right process, and make sure we're in the correct position to make the decision. Sort of some examples of some quite bizarre decisions that have been made this year or over the recent time period. A few months ago in Cyprus, when they were they introduced a financial tax, and then the banks, so they announced they were going to tax everybody, whatever it was, 20% of their amounts in their accounts. And the banks had to close to stop a run on the banks. Like, surely that was obvious that was a disaster waiting to happen. The other example that quite amazes me is the growth of biofuels. It's actually resulted in more trees being cut down in the Amazon because nobody understood that the effect of using corn to produce biofuels, ethanol, in the US, pushed up the price of these products. So people started cutting down trees in the rainforest to grow them. That really wasn't what the intended outcome of that action was. So why are these bad decisions made? They're clever people running governments, maybe not. But there are some sort of common patterns that underpin quite a few bad decisions. The consequences of the decision were unpopular. The sort of most high visibility instance of that was the failure of the O-ring on the Challenger, which resulted in it blowing up. Quite a few people knew that there was that problem in place, but really nobody wanted to put their hand up and say, because they knew it was going to be very, very unpopular. Another one that happens quite a lot in IT projects is unwillingness to throw away the existing investment. So we spend, oh gosh.
Sorry.
No, that's great. You know, we spent years on this. What do you mean you can't maintain it anymore? Just do some more of that. It'll be fine. Often people just don't research enough. They don't have all the information they need to make the decision, which is, you know, something that should be reasonably easily rectified. Another one that I've come across quite a few times in large IT projects is there's an elephant in the room. Like, everyone's talking about the small problems and the small decisions. Meanwhile, there's this huge issue that nobody really wants to address just now. And to be honest, you need to sort out the big problem and then look at the small decisions, because the outcome of the big decision is going to impact the small decisions. But, you know, nobody really wants to face up to it. And the other one is CV-driven choices. Now, there's actually a way of getting around that. If you just sort of describe to your manager that, well, I've investigated the resource profile that's going to be in place over the next few years, and we believe that this technology is going to grow, and we need to adopt this technology to make sure that we can get the appropriate resources in the future, yada, yada, yada. Sometimes CV-driven choices can be okay, but frequently not. So I've got some examples. See if this works with my mouse. No, that didn't work at all. Sorry. Worked when I tested it. I'll just run them from here. See what happens. That looks bad, but it's fine.
Dieser zur Unfallverhütung konzipierte Nachrüstsatz für Motorräder
Can't hear it, but it's in German.
entwickelt. Die technischen Details sind vertraulich, aber wir zeigen Ihnen die wichtigsten Eigenschaften des Prototyps. Der integrierte Computer überwacht die Radumgebung mit Hilfe von Video- und Datenübertragung. Das Programm sucht fortlaufend nach Risikofaktoren wie zum Beispiel Fahrzeuge und Fußgänger und analysiert Tausende von potenziellen Gefahrensituationen. Es prüft an einer Kreuzung zum Beispiel, ob ein Autofahrer sie gesehen hat. Die ermittelten Risiken werden an einen außen am Fahrradhelm angebrachten Empfänger übertragen. Und der Fahrer sieht auf einem im Helm integrierten Display, wo und worin die Gefahr besteht. Das Auto fährt auf die Kreuzung zu, ohne dass der Fahrer prüft, ob sich ein Motorradfahrer nähert. Das Fahrrad erkennt dies als potenzielle Gefahr und warnt seinen Fahrer rechtzeitig. Wir können die Aufnahmen aus dem Helmsystem herunterladen und Ihnen genau zeigen, was der Fahrer gesehen hat. Dann mal losfahren.
No one was hurt, honest, that was just a mistake. The next one is not in English. Close that one. So that's, you know, the power of innovation. It's great design. And the other one is it's important you validate your design.
You know the new Mercedes S-Class, okay, it's got this cruise control on it. It's like an active cruise control. We've got some footage here of how it works, okay? You're driving along, there's a radar in front of you, and it can sense if the car in front has stopped or even if it is an emergency stop, and it will bring you to a big halt.
So you don't crash. It's very clever, isn't
So
it?
you don't have to touch the brakes, it will just sense the car in front. Okay, now a German TV company went to Mercedes and said, we'd quite like to film that happening, for real if we may. So Mercedes said, yeah, come on down the factory, we'll set up an experiment for you and film it. And this is what happened. Here's the car, okay, out of the building, into the fog. Guy can see nothing. For the Germans. Oh, I'm feeling a little hot under my...
It gets politically incorrect after that. So. apparently they forgot to turn it on. So, over to you guys. Can you just take a moment to think about what's the hardest decision you've ever had to make and why it was hard? IT related only, please, no, personal stories.
To stop projects, that's the hardest thing, I think, to stop something that is obviously going wrong.
And have you seen that happen? Did it work? How did people...
Every couple of days, yeah.
Oh.
Quite often. But it is a problem, and I think one of the things that you talked about was that elephant in the room syndrome and the amount of investment that's already been put in place. People tend to shy away from making that decision. So you end up just throwing good money after bad.
Absolutely.
To tell a stakeholder that their idea just isn't a good one, when you're under a lot of pressure to just do what they say because they might be a director or something, and to actually go and say, this is just going to waste a lot of money if we do it.
How did you handle it?
It was rough. I basically was honest with them, and they eventually came around to it. So.
Mm-hmm. Only 2 people make hard decisions. Don't believe that.
Same thing as stopping a project, but in this case, found out later that the global CTO's bonus had been linked to rolling out this system across the globe. And they were trying to boil the ocean, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And I was the only person in the room that kept saying no. Yeah, that wasn't easy.
Yeah, it makes you pretty unpopular. I've actually just been doing that on a project I'm currently on. And it's like, you're just a troublemaker. It's like, I don't intend to be a troublemaker. I want the project to be successful. However, I think we need to, make some changes. Anyone else? Someone over this side.
We have the opposite issue. The problem that we make, we stop projects too often after significant investments have been put into them. And that's largely driven by business decisions and changes in the business climate that we're working in. But they're usually decisions that are forced on the IT departments.
Is that because the business priorities change, or?
They do, and we have external factors that play a big role in that. So the IT department has to work within those decisions that are made by other senior management.
Of course. And is it that the business are expecting need a shorter delivery time to take advantage of the product that you're developing, or does
not really.
they just change the minds?
We've got quite a lean delivery model, and I think that's okay. I think that they're seeing business value being rapidly, but we do have a very dynamic and aggressive business climate that we're working in. When you do partnerships with other companies, that has ramifications on the type of projects that you're working on, even though they're good projects and they're delivering value.
Okay. So, yeah, please.
One of them I can come up with from lately is we are starting a new project that is very much like some of the other ones that we have running the same architecture in the bottom. And people have been working on Windows Presentation Foundation for the other projects, and we have a lot of people who is good at that now. But it seems that we'd be better off starting with new technology for the next one, and to be able to push that
So you saying the new technology choice is a bad one?
No, I'm
But
saying
not,
rest of
not the
world
technology is
and
not bad, but the actual planning of the adoption.
It's hard to decide whether should I go for the one that the rest of the organization
Mhm.
uses, or should I pick the other one because the rest of the world is moving in that direction now, and that is where Microsoft is investing now.
Mhm.
We want to get new developers on and offshore, etc. That will be easier. So, and what is best for the a lot of factors. Which one weighs the most?
Absolutely. Excellent. Okay. So, I think when the previous talk I went to, I forget the guy's name, when he was sort of describing the thank you. Just doing it all by magic now. When he was describing what's the difference between Agile and architecture, describes, come up with some nouns about architecture. Decision making was the first one that was mentioned, which I thought was good, because I think decision making is one of the key activities in architecture. I won't go as far as some folks to say it's the only activity in architecture. Jan Bosch has a view that it's all about architectural decision making. But, making decisions, understanding what the drivers are behind the decisions, making sure that you've researched the options, you've thought about all the appropriate options that are in place, you manage to convince your stakeholders that this is the right decision, you've got the right thing in place, you've made the right decision. And then you do need to document the decision. I know some may say it's not very agile, however, that's just a joke. But you do need to document the decision because it's important to understand why the decision was made, not just for now, but for the future. In 6 months' time, when somebody comes along and comes up with a new idea and thinks that your idea was wrong or whatever the decision was wrong, it's really helpful to be able to go back to the original thought processes behind the decisions, because not only does the decision may not be correct in light of what's happened on the project. There may be new requirements, there may be new constraints, there may be new technologies. That's fine, but the fact that you went through the decision-making process 6 months ago, all that's valuable because you thought about the pros and cons, you thought about the scenarios, and somebody trying to change that decision, can reuse that information so they don't have to, redo all that work. And of course, the decision needs to be communicated. The concept of ivory tower architects who make a decision and the development teams never know about it. That's happened in quite a few projects, and is never a good thing. So not only do you need to share the decision, you need to make sure that people really understand it, understand what it means to the code that's being developed, or make sure the ramifications of the decision are understood. Just nodding and then going off and doing something different really isn't the appropriate way forward. And part of that, as you've described the decision and you've documented it properly, people are generally, they want to do what the right thing is. So if you've made a convincing case, then it will get carried through into the actual development of the project. So it's quite interesting to sort of think about when and why you're making various decisions. You don't want to do a huge amount of, why is it doing this? I hate it. It doesn't normally do this. So you don't want to make the decisions too early, but you do need to make them. And it's quite suppose this is where, what's the difference between art and science and architecture? It is quite hard to actually get the timing right, and it's something you sort of learn over time. The other sort of big conflict sometimes that can emerge is the difference between the view of an enterprise architect and the view of the solution architect. So, the enterprise architect is thinking across all the systems within their domain or within the organisation and thinking about the impact on those, whereas the solution architect is generally looking at either a smaller set of those projects, those systems, because they're implementing, a single project, may span several systems, or they're just looking at their own project, their own single system, and it's about a trade-off and a discussion between the two. Don't want to pay too much attention to enterprise architects anyway. Hope there aren't too many of those in the room. There's also the architects versus the project manager's view. So from the architect's perspective, you're really looking at the lifetime of the system. So from when we start the project, when it's a gleam in somebody's eye, until you actually turn off the lights in the computer centre, you've decommissioned the boxes. That's really the lifetime of the decisions that you're making at the start of the project, when you're selecting technologies, when you're working out what the design patterns are, when you're making some of these choices. You need to think about, actually, this system's going to run for ages, therefore it influences my decision. Some of the systems that Indaba write are for sporting events in the digital media side, and actually they'll run for 6 months. That's all they need to run for. They're for the Open Golf or some things for the Olympics. So things like flexibility, future-proofing, maintainability became far less important. There's some of our other systems for financial services. We're thinking about, actually, this might run for 20 years. Therefore, that significantly impacts the decisions that are made. And that's the job of the architect, whereas the project manager is all about, this is the end date of the project and I deliver it into live, and that's what's important to me. Dynamic tension, I think they call it. So also, I think the architect needs to think about the business value, the real benefits that the business are going to derive from the project that's being delivered, from the code that's being delivered. Whereas the project manager will sort of be thinking about the business case, because if they're following a structured project management approach, they'll have to justify the business case. Does it really do what the users want? No, but I've delivered the business case. It's not really a good place to be. And of course, from the architectural perspective, we're looking at the quality attributes, maintainability, scalability, flexibility, etc. I want a kitten, to be honest.
Could I possibly suggest that security might come into that, into play there?
Yes, sorry. It wasn't intended to be a complete list, but security is absolutely a cross-cutting concern that needs to be considered. There's probably reusability, performance. There's quite a few things that I didn't put in there. So you also need to understand the scope of your decision. When you're making big decisions, decisions in a very complex environment. This is really starting to irritate me now. In a complex state, say you're working on a program of work, and there's many systems involved, and you've got to make a choice. You can think of the discussion can very often degenerate into trying to think about everything at the same time. It's described as an unbounded decision. And these are really hard. Well, actually, they're so hard that they can't be taken. So you need to define the boundaries of your decision and also identify who are the key stakeholders. And I quite like this diagram that I've sort of adjusted from a guy called Thoreau. And I sort of put an IT slant on it a little bit. So if you think, if you sort of see the diagram, across the bottom I've got the sort of the numbers of systems that are going to be involved in your decision or impacted in the decision. And on the left-hand side, the number of stakeholders. So you can start to see that the more systems and the more stakeholders, you know, the worse the decision gets, or the harder the decision gets to make. So, you know, few stakeholders, you know, few systems, simple. It's like, what am I going to have for breakfast? Cereal or toast? Oh gosh, that's not too hard, is it? As the number of systems increase, you're starting to move into the space of enterprise architecture. You need to sort of think about how they're going to impact the things. Information becomes key, and also you need to understand what the impact of technical debt is going to be on all these systems, because they may be existing systems. So if you make a decision now that hasn't been followed by these systems in the past, you're immediately imposing a level of technical debt on them, and do they change to be in line with your new decision way of doing things. So, you know, that's sort of just a few people. What do I want off the Chinese menu? The whole range of things, but you need to do it, but it's not too bad. As the number of stakeholders increase, you're really looking at what Thoreau described as wicked problems. This is all about people management, really. It's about your soft skills. It's about how you convince people, how you really understand what's important for your stakeholders. Typical example of these are sort of staff problems, resourcing problems. You know, the example of what's going to happen to the teams if I change technologies. Are we going to have to retrain them all, or do we make them all redundant? And hopefully not. And reskill. So when you've got a large number of stakeholders, it's your soft skills that come into play. And of course, when you've got a large number of systems and a large number of stakeholders, and Thoreau described these as wicked messes. It's a very scary title. And these are really unmanageable. Things will tend to descend into chaos. You know, Heathrow Terminal 5 was an example, implementation was an example of that. You know, there was just too much going on. That can sometimes happen on large sort of IT programs of work when the organisation's being too ambitious. So they're actually trying to introduce a lot of change all at once. So I'm sort of familiar with a project where they were trying to restructure the business, move location, actually move their data centres, redevelop all their software systems, and fundamentally change the business process as well, all at the same time. Interesting, very interesting. So yes. I won't dwell on that one, but I mean, so much, trying to do too much at the same time, it's always going to be very, very challenging. So, any other sort of things that you think have significant impact on the scope of a decision? I'm going to have to get you to sing, aren't I? A rousing chorus.
Available time,
Mm-hmm. Good point. So you're talking about the time the decision is going to be in play for, or actually when you need to make the decision?
I think, when you need to make the decision.
Perhaps conflicting drivers in the timing of the decision. You've got one set of drivers, budgetary perhaps, pushing you into making a decision now. But at the same time, you know that you are not ready to make that decision
Yeah, that's
or you're awaiting developments elsewhere.
yeah, that's a really interesting thing where you have annual budgets in corporate IT departments, and you need to set the budget for next year. It's like, but I don't know what we're going to do next year. That's a very valid point. So you can say something?
Yep.
No, somebody in front. I thought I heard another.
It's related to that,
Sorry.
just the financial impact of the decision you're making. If it's a large amount of money you're talking about, then the decision is that much more difficult to make, or can be.
Yeah, is that because, does that map onto stakeholders? Because you've got to convince more layers of senior management? Maybe not.
Perhaps just because there's a financial impact, there's a strong need to make a better decision.
Yeah.
You can have sort of reputation consequences as well, because I've worked on safety critical systems before, and decisions about that revolve around the fact that it will look bad if we kill people.
Just a bit.
Sometimes the amount of data you've got available to make the decision, to base a decision on, sometimes you just don't have enough data, and yet you have to make a decision.
Is that because you don't understand how the system's going to work, or
It could be
just
because, for example, a web-based system, the analytics on the existing system aren't good enough. And, you're building a new system, you're not basing it on existing data. So,
that's a good point.
When there is a lot of factors that is out of your control, that you don't know where they're going to move in the future. So you have to predict where they will end up when your system will be delivered.
So, do you mean like features or?
But when the stakeholders are not stable.
Yes. So, right. So that then it becomes even more important to document, so that when they come back and harangue you for your decision, you can say, well, I consulted the stakeholders at the time, and they said this, and they agreed to this.
Possibly related to that, stakeholders aren't directly questionable. A good example is a web development where you're not in a position to directly talk to the people who will be using the website, and what you have are internal proxies for them, and you're not confident that they actually understand what the website is there for and is there to do. Speak from experience.
So it's a bit like they're using the iPad as a camera type thing. Nobody even thought of that one. Okay. So I'm just trying to see what's going to happen next. So sometimes you'll get a counterintuitive answer. A lot of decisions do get made sort of on gut feel. We don't have time. There are thousands of decisions to be made on an IT project. And heuristics can be very powerful, but they're not always correct. I don't know if any of you, if you're aware of this, if you've come across this problem before, you'll know it, but I love this problem because every time I read it, and I've read it several times, it still feels strange to me. So basically, on a game show, this was in the 50s, I think, in the US, there was a game show, Deal or No Deal, or I don't know I can't remember what it was called. The host, Monty Hall, had a contestant, and they had 3 doors. And they could select one of the doors. The contestant had to select one of the doors. Behind 2 of the doors, there were goats, and behind the other door was a rather nice car. Now, on the basis that the contestant would want the rather nice car as opposed to the goat, some of you may want goats, but assume they wanted the nice car, the contestant would choose a door, tell the host which door, not open it at that point. So then the host, who has full knowledge of what's behind which door, actually selects one of the other doors that the contestant didn't, opens it, and there's a goat behind it. So, okay. The host then gives the contestant the choice. You can stick with your original selection, or you can change. What would you do? How many of you would change your original choice? How many would stay with your original choice? About 50-50-ish. Those of you who didn't vote at all obviously don't want a car. Whatever. You should change, basically. I'm not going to go into the maths. I put a link to the maths behind the probability in play. But basically, when you made the selection, when all 3 doors were closed, you had a 33% chance, a 3% chance of hitting the car, selecting the car at random. However, when the host, who knew where the car was, opened the door and there was a goat, there's 2 doors remaining and you actually have a 50-50 chance. So you should change. I find that really counterintuitive. Even when I know the answer, it's like, I really don't like that one. So I just thought that was quite interesting.
The host adds new information, so the problem is not the same.
Exactly.
If you film your own, actually, if the host don't want you to win, you can't win at all as the first choice. Whatever door you choose, the host can find a goal behind it. So anyway, the best you can do is to have another choice than
Yes.
one of the hosts.
Absolutely. So it's the, in the light of new information, reevaluate your decision is either reevaluate, you should always reevaluate it. You might come up with the original decision, but in this case, you're more likely to hit the car if you change. So, looking at techniques to help you with your decision making. You're not talking enough. You're going too quick. Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. They can help you understand the landscape of your decisions. How many of you use that technique, for understanding problems? Yay. Good, bad, useful, not useful? Do you want to share an example, maybe? No.
A lot of time people make decisions based on emotion, and if you're talking about a number of stakeholders, especially at the same time, to get people to hone in on the pros and cons, it's really useful to look at each of the decisions or options objectively. If you don't, then you generally go on an option which is not quite as popular, and you can't really make a complete return on investment decision unless you know what all the positives and negatives are.
Okay. Good point. One of the presenters earlier was talking about groupthink, so it's quite useful to actually make sure that you've done true brainstorming of the options, not just looked at the obvious 2 or 3. Get a full list of what the options are, what we can consider. I mean, there may be some bad ones. Discard those quickly, don't spend too long on them. But quite often a sort of a brainstorming approach will generate new ideas, off-the-wall thinking, and they can come up with really valuable insights and really valuable options. So brainstorm your options. You can create mental models of your problem, so that you're really understanding what the influences are, what are the drivers, what's the basis behind making this decision, and also the consequences. What's going to happen that's going to be positive on this decision, and what's going to provide negative feedback. You can use a technique called causal loop diagrams. They're quite interesting, quite useful. They describe, the complexity and the effects. I put sort of a little example. I'm not going to go into it in detail. That's quite an interesting, where you've got a really big decision to make, that's quite a useful technique. And then do a risk analysis as well. What are the key risk factors involved in this?
There's another useful technique people might want to look at. It's called ACH, Analysis of Competing Hypotheses.
Tell us about it.
It's,
That's brilliant.
You can look at there's a video on YouTube about it, but it's a semi-formal technique that was developed for making decisions about national defence. So it tries to be rigorous about the...
Pretty rigorous, yes.
Decision is national defence what?
Well, you know, whether or not you trust the output of it is a different question entirely, but at least it's a fairly rigorous process.
Okay.
So,
Thank you.
HGH, analysis of competing hypotheses.
I have to remember that one. So another technique that's quite interesting is system thinking. Sort of, it's an extension of the causal loop, I guess. Again, to understand how the decisions and actors sort of affect each other, how change in one area will impact on another area. Impacts can be positive, negative, or neutral. And understanding how these drivers interact will help you identify the consequences of your decision in the long term. I mean, this is what wasn't done when the, let's start using all the corn produced in the Midwest plains for biofuels. Actually what's going to happen, it wasn't done there. So these are quite painful problems sometimes. Also in system thinking, there's some common patterns worth looking for. They describe them as system archetypes. I just want to say system architect, sorry. And I put a couple of links for more info. I particularly like the paper by William Braun. It's sort of semi-academic but understandable. And looking at the system archetypes, I've just sort of pulled a few out to sort of give you a flavour of what they're like. I'm not going to spend too long on any of these, but where you see an example that you've come across, let's share that, because otherwise they're all just my examples. So basically, where you've got an organisation or a situation with this very fast expansion happening, but there's a constraint that's going to limit the growth in the future. This is sort of typically a natural resources type scenario, which is used to describe this. In IT, I think the obvious thing that I've seen happen is capacity. So fast growth of take-up actually breaks the system. This sort of thing that happens in, I publish my brand new website and it crashes on day one because far too many people have tried to link to it. Sort of on the longer term, it can be very serious because people start to use a service, streaming video service or something. More people use it, and then the quality degrades, and then everybody moves away from it, and they lose most of their customer base. So what do you do about this? You absolutely need to identify what your limiting factors are and plan for them. Sometimes you might want to throttle the initial performance, and so people don't get unrealistic expectations. I've seen that done on pricing engines in trading systems to make sure that the first adopters don't get instantaneous response, and then so it gradually degrades over time, and they get unhappy. If you've got a constant response, that can be useful. Unpopular with the business, but you might want to restrict initial growth. You might want to put some limits in place, and obviously you must monitor the performance of the system so you can take action at the appropriate time. This is one that happens a lot. It's called shifting the burden. But basically there are fundamental problems in place with your system, but you're applying some quick fixes which just make the problem worse. You're not addressing the underlying cause of the problem. Patching code as opposed to proper refactoring. This happens a lot. The reluctance to change your underlying technology. Each project can get by with what we've got currently, but basically it's just making the issue worse. So what do you do about this? You need to actually identify what the fundamental problem is. It's amazing how often organisations or projects just don't do this. You'll get the same issue, failure in live production time and time again, and they haven't actually worked out that, oh well, actually we're running out of file store because this piece of code is generating far too many log entries. So let's give more file store. Haven't identified the fundamental problem. That sounds a mad thing, but I've actually seen that happen. Well, why don't we just fix the code so it's not doing that? Oh yeah, we could do that. So that's a bizarre thing, but does happen. Where you're trying to get budget to actually fix the underlying problem, you need to know the cost that each fast fix you have to make entails, or what the lost opportunity is. And then if you model those changes, if it's like a big change, you can model the cost and benefit of the investment over several projects, so convince the business that, yeah, it is right to make this change.
But you mentioned reluctance to change technology. I would suggest that the converse can also be a problem, in which if you're too ready to introduce new technologies in order to solve the problem, you can end up creating long-term support problems, because the IT department is then too fragmented and trying to support too many technologies, and managing the capabilities of your IT department is a challenge in its own right.
Absolutely, yes. Good point. Eroding goals. This happens a lot on IT projects, basically. When it becomes apparent that a target won't be met, what's the first thing you do? You just slip the goal, basically, lower the goal. Projects running late, we can take shortcuts. You can accrue technical debt rather than actually improve the process. It's not a good thing to do. You need to make sure that you're monitoring the projects for repeated slippage and de-scoping, so you actually know it's happening. And is it the delivery capability that's not performing appropriately, or were the original timescales unrealistic? Either of those can be the case. Sometimes it's right to slip the end date. Other times there's something more sort of fundamental going wrong, and just by slipping and slipping and slipping, you're not actually going to make the problem better. So I'd quite like to ask you a question on this one. So I've worked on quite a few projects where the scope is decreased so that an end date can be met. What do you do with the remaining scope? What's the techniques that you've seen in?
Phase 2.
Phase 2.
If it's important enough, there'll be, if your project's got a fixed budget and fixed date, if it's important enough, it'll come back again as a second project.
It also depends what you de-scope. So if you de-scope some of the nice-to-haves as opposed to the must-haves, then they might decide, well, actually, that's good enough. The customers are paying for it. They're happy to carry on. So it depends what you de-scope.
Mm-hmm. Sometimes you really can't have a phase 2. I haven't, but I know someone who worked for the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and it's a case of, no, the deadline is a planetary conjunction. We really can't reschedule it.
Yeah, I can see that would be a problem.
It's not our job to de-scope things. It's our job to raise these risks up to our stakeholders.
Good point.
And for them to reprioritise what we should be doing. So I don't really see on the previous slide, actually it is still on this slide, that we should be doing anything at that stage other than talking to our stakeholders. So
this is from the organisational perspective, but yeah, so yes, IT doesn't de-scope. You present the issues and the options and what can be de-scoped.
That's our job as architects,
yeah.
though, isn't it? To then eloquently place those risks back in the business domain for them to make those appropriate decisions, understanding what the implications of that change in priority is.
Mm.
And sometimes test that with a recommendation for an approach.
Of course, yeah, you give option papers and that kind of thing.
Okay.
give people those options.
One of the things that I tripped over quite early in doing architecture was the pressure for end date and the features deliver the user requirements and all the quality attributes. Oh, we just won't do those. We'll do those as a phase 2. Don't do that. That didn't go well.
That's not saying don't do that, because you will end up with a system that will not be able to meet your needs for tomorrow.
Absolutely.
But realistically, it's normally IT that says, right, we'll do this the next iteration or next release. The guys in the business domain never understand what those things actually are, and it's our responsibility as part of an IT organisation to deliver it, because that's part of the company's benefits, not a commercial benefit.
Mm-hmm.
And our responsibility within the IT part of the organisation is to deliver business value, not just commercial value.
Absolutely. So yeah, so you have to think that the IT operations manager is also your stakeholder. So, and the CIO is also your stakeholder. So you can't just, I'll not bother with those quality attributes, but we'll deliver all the functionality. It won't be maintainable. It'll fall over all the time. No, that's not good. Because you'll never convince the business to invest in implementing logging, proper logging.
That shouldn't be their decision.
Absolutely. As I say, it was a long time ago. And it was, oh dear, shouldn't have done that.
I disagree with that. That is our job, to convince the business that that's a good thing to do, and what it provides them. That's exactly what we should be doing. Logging provides us with that capability of understanding what has gone wrong, and then time to fix is quicker. If we can't eloquently place those risks back against the business, then I think we're missing the trick.
What I'm saying is, who ends up owning the product or the feature in terms of supporting it? And it's those are the stakeholders that should be signing off on logging, not
necessarily business.
If you haven't got them, then you're missing all your stakeholders.
Yeah. So commercial stakeholders for a project can't make a decision, or shouldn't be making a decision on the operations part.
I think it is our job to describe the consequences. However, it's much easier to say, I can reduce a fully, some features with all the quality attributes in place by the time you need them, and we'll slip these other features into the next release, rather than say, I deliver all the features you requested, and then we'll implement the quality attributes in the next release. Because by the time you get onto the next release, they've got another whole load of features that they want to put in. So I found it a very hard discussion having made that. So I'd always try and make sure you deliver the quality attributes in the thing you're doing. Yes, and that includes convincing them that we need to put logging in place, of course, and they're going to need to pay for it.
But I think once you've done that convincing, then it gets baked into the definition of done.
Yes.
So when you say I'm doing this, it means you are performance testing it, you are unit testing
Absolutely.
it.
I was going to say it's like the unit testing you should always include in your initial definition of done.
I also suggest that where possible, having to make this decision shouldn't come as a surprise to the stakeholders, that you should be advising them up front that there is the possibility of things going wrong, and informing them of what the sort of things that you're looking for, what you're measuring, in order to have some confidence that you know what you're talking about, but also to give them something by which to judge the fact that the circumstance you warned about has come about.
Mm-hmm.
Some organisations have a reluctance to speak bad news upwards.
Yes.
I think the recent debacle of the Universal Credit Programme is a good example of this. There was a reluctance to pass the bad news up on the good news.
Good point, thank you. So another scenario that happens quite often is that the bulk of investment will go to a team or a person who's already successful. Typically this can happen in the IT context where you've got a greenfield project system. They get all the investment. because they're, it's quite simple for them. They haven't got 50,000 existing users who need to be migrated onto the new platform. They just start and get going, and everything looks wonderful. So I was actually involved in a conversation at a very large bank, and they were telling me how wonderful this new system that they'd developed was, and for corporate, a banking product for corporates. And I said, yeah, it sounds great. How many users? How many companies are using it? I said, 50 out of their client base of, I don't know, probably 50, 60, 70,000. Yeah, well, it will be great then. So, and that can permeate through. But it's important for the organisation, hard for us as architects, to make sure that, resources are spent in the appropriate place. Another thing that can happen quite frequently is called the tragedy of the commons. Basically, we have a limited resource in place, which is shared across teams or components. Everybody uses everything that they're allocated, and of course there's not enough to go around. This happens, I've seen this happen quite a lot, particularly around specialist team, like DBAs. In fact, it's happening on the project I'm on at the moment. There just aren't enough DBAs to go around. The initial judgment was, this many people to service the role. However, nothing was really planned out. So what's happening is all the projects want the DBAs at exactly the same time. So although theoretically there should be just enough to go round, it's actually causing bottlenecks to the project. So you need to actually properly estimate the demand, plan the demand, anticipate the peaks, and also create some sort of cross-team targets, so that across the projects they're actually working together a little bit to make sure that they're not overusing the shared resource. This one's so obvious, fixes that fail, basically. Yeah, we're patching the code, but it's only covering one scenario. It's actually messing up another area. Just you need to make sure you've addressed the underlying cause. Another thing that happens to legacy systems quite a lot, growth and underinvestment. So failure to invest in the long term results in a decline in performance. Gosh, what a surprise. So again, this is a failure to renew technology in a timely manner, failure to invest in staff. You need to understand, particularly in this instance, the delays between investment and the increase in performance. So if you start to see a decline, either in technology, we can't redevelop the system instantaneously. There's going to be a lag time, be that 3 months, 6 months, a year. The same with staff. You can't get rid of all your existing staff and just rehire. That's not going to be the right thing to do anyway. You've got to have, understand what the lag time is between your investment and maintain the investment over time to avoid the troughs in performance. And escalation. This is really more of an organisational problem. Can happen among IT teams. I've seen it happen in Agile teams, actually. Basically, you're focusing on your measures and actually undermining the competition. I'm always focusing on my performance against the competition. I've seen it happen in IT departments where they're focusing on their performance against another one. One instance, an infrastructure providing organisation, the IT infrastructure department, were so targeted on reducing their costs, they actually resulted on making the application architecture far more complex. It was quite interesting. There was a lot of MQ messaging in place, and the IT infrastructure org banned the use of persistent messaging, that you can't have it, or made it really, really hard for applications to put it in place. So the applications actually had to to code round it. They had to work round it, where the obvious organisational or project level decision was, we'll just use persistent messaging then. That was quite bizarre, but because they had power and they were, reporting up different senior lines, they got away with it. Very odd. So you actually need to understand these damaging impacts and raise them at the appropriate level. As architects, you need to raise them, be it at the CIO or whatever level. So those, those are quite useful just to have as a checklist to run through your mind when you're looking at decisions, and to make sure you're not going to fall into any of those traps, because they do come up again and again. So, as I said, the behaviour tends to follow these patterns that you can then work through. I don't think the fish really expected that bear to be there. So have you used any of these techniques? Or do you think of examples of decisions you've made where you could have used these techniques?
Sometimes the technique I've used is to just simply assume, right, assuming that this decision is a cock-up, what are the consequences? And then, assuming that it turns out to be the wrong decision, pick the one with the least worst consequences of getting it wrong. Not saying it's a good way of making a decision.
That's quite interesting.
But sometimes if things are otherwise finely balanced, it may be the way that I would use to drive the decision.
So, okay. It's a bit like a sort of a failure modes and effects analysis being applied to a decision making. So I'm going to look for all the failures and...
Yes, if it goes wrong, how bad will the mess be?
Okay. Any other?
The particular example I mentioned earlier, I took word for word what the CTO had said the new system would achieve and said, right, these are must-haves for the POC to prove.
Mm-hmm.
I knew it would fail. And then handed over to the testers. And then they said, right, unless you do X, Y, Z, it's a fail. And it failed. But we had to go through the expense of doing a POC.
Yeah, but better than implementing the whole project, of course. Okay. So how many decisions have you made in the last 24 hours? A, between? Yes. Apparently, the average adult makes 35,000 decisions in 24 hours. But this is according to the internet, and they were Americans. I don't know whether that's relative. Seems an awful lot.
Is that 35,000 different decisions, just the same one?
Wasn't that explicit, but it maybe it was.
It sort of depends on what you count as a decision.
Yeah, of course.
Technically, every muscle will
Yes.
be a decision.
I think they must have counted quite a few of those unconscious decisions, obviously. So all that's trying to say is you need some process, but just enough process. Thought I'd stop doing that. You need to understand whether it's just a simple decision, if it's local, is it fit, is it changeable, what's the impact. So if it's simple, local, mutable, honestly, don't invest. Record it, maybe stick it in put it on a post-it note, might be informal, communicate it. If you've got a big cost impact, if it's going to affect multiple teams, if it's talking about a technology challenge, then you need to go through a bit more process, understand what the drivers are, state the options, yada yada, the usual things. We need to understand the impacts on cost and delivery time. But that's quite a key thing. I've seen quite a few architects after a project started or set of projects started actually make architectural decisions and code has already been cut and actually fail to consider the impact on the existing code. So don't do that. You might need to do a proof of concept, but you need to formally communicate your decision and check the understanding. If it's strategically significant to the organisation, then you actually might require a whole project to actually make the decision.
Also, yesterday, Tom Gill talked about an estimation table where you put in what is the key goals and stakeholders that must be fulfilled or should be fulfilled, and then on every option that you have, you put them in this table where you have this one will give us 90% of the goal. This other one will only give us 10% on that goal, and then how much they will cost each time, and then you can and the risk involved or the credibility, and then you can set them up and see which is the best decision.
Okay. That's really interesting. I haven't looked at that work of Tom's, but I will do. Sounds really useful.
One of the decision technique we use is what we refer to as an architectural review, which is effectively of a proposed architecture. There will be a full day review. You'll have the various stakeholders in the room, both technical and the business. And you've got two elements to it. You're reviewing the different options that are being presented and assessing those against what we regard as the architecturally significant requirements, and we assess the risk that the proposed architecture will fail to meet those requirements. So we end up with a view of the different option risks. And the other side of that as well is we do an architectural fitness review, and we are reviewing it against the various abilities, maintainability, security, performance.
Do you do those at different points in the life cycle?
Well, we have a formal review, which is really a high ceremony end of phase point, and this is really a key activity and assignment.
Okay.
We're looking at ways of trying to move away from the one big meeting, which is big and expensive to organise, but does at least get everybody together where you get a lot of discussion around different aspects. And we're trying to look at ways of breaking this down into a number of smaller activities so that the big meeting tends to be shorter when it happens and less traumatic for the unfortunate architect.
Yeah, I've been on projects where I've had to, follow a TOGAP architectural governance process, and you present your architecture to everybody, and you have to be prepared. You really do, otherwise you can get torn to pieces if people want to. Oh. So I just thought I'd very quickly share a little template. It strangely wouldn't embed in the document, but literally, just quick purpose of document, background, make sure you describe what the context is, any history behind the decision, what are your requirements, non-functional and functional, that will significantly impact this decision. Describe the options briefly in business terms, because you're going to be talking to the business, and then obviously document each of your options. Frequently a diagram's required, impact on the key business drivers that you identified. You're always going to have cost and time to delivery in addition to the others. Describe the pros and cons, and then the recommendations, other options, summary, etc. So that's what I tend to use, maybe on a slide deck, maybe in a Word document. Currently on the project I'm on, we're doing it on Confluence, but the same information.
You stop subconscious bias creeping into those, because I know that I've done that in the past, and then later on you look back and you realise what you presented was in fact option 1, that London catches fire, option 2, board eaten by alligators, option 3, my choice.
Well, hopefully somebody will be signing this off, and they should catch that. The other thing to always include is a do nothing option, because it's beloved of management. And as architects, you don't always include it, but senior managers will always say, and what if we don't do anything at all? You can't not do anything at all. So include that as a choice, as an option. I think we should, if it's unconscious bias, that's hard, other than getting somebody to review it, to peer review it, to make sure that you haven't got that in place.
I have to say, when I do a document like that, I won't put a recommendation in there. I'll do the options, and I'll make it very clear the benefits of each one, but I will avoid putting a recommendation in, and I'll leave that for either the business or my management decision instead.
But then you do put a recommendation in there.
It's subconscious one.
Subconscious.
If there is an option in your favour, you will minimise the cons a little bit, just weak language, maximise the pros. With the options you don't like, particularly if they're credible options, the cons will just seem a little bit harder.
You're absolutely right. I think recently, where I've been, working for a consultancy organisation, I don't say I'm less invested, maybe fractionally more objective, because I'm not working for the organisation, so it's easier to put the pros and cons. I'm not going to be living with this, It's not my CV that's going to benefit. They're not my friends that'll get made redundant. So that's very harsh. So maybe it's slightly easier, but it is a very good point.
It's a very good point that you can be independent and make decisions independently, because you don't have to live with the decisions.
And as a professional, I want to, make sure it's the right recommendation, obviously, or they are properly captured.
There is a danger with a document like this, that is that you're not sure that the pros and cons that you put in there are actually mapped to the requirements for the system, and which one are the most important of those pros and cons, if there are just as many for two systems.
Yeah, that's sort of why I sort of put the section in about what are the key business drivers, what should we be looking at for the pros and cons, because as you say, maintainability for a system that's going to run for 6 months, not so important. Yeah, absolutely.
Pound and dollar signs always help.
You're always going to have cost and time.
We've kind of moved away from this kind of thing now. We present options on functionality and the functionality that's been requested, and the technical implementation and the technical options are left down to the product team, the product development team. The impact of that, though, means if something goes wrong with the technical side of the product, someone has to come in at 3 o'clock in the morning from that product development team to fix it. And that creates a vested interest to make sure that whatever we're doing, we're doing it for the right reasons. The development team don't get paid overtime. No one in the project will ever get paid overtime. But the key thing is, the other key part of it is to make sure that the commercial contacts are actually part of the product team, and they've also got a vested interest in the long-term aspect of that product, not just I want this feature live so my customer can use it. And it's got to the point now where commercial product manager, so to speak, as I've heard them sell on the phone to other people, we can't do that, that's not maintainable. It's just for a product person to say that.
Excellent. Mature then. Sometimes you might get multiple areas of choice involved, where you're trying to fit together sort of a whole set of options on different systems. And when that happens, you need to make sure that you've got the boundaries very clearly defined, identify the options for each area, and then put them into the set of scenarios. Because if you've got 3 areas that you're looking at options for and 3 options for each, you then end up with 9 different combinations. Some of them just don't make sense. You should be able to sort of sift out 3 or 4 scenarios of the different sets of options, which had.
On the opposite of that, I've quite often in situations where, other than doing nothing, I can only find one option. There's only a single option I can find that how we could implement what they want, and I rack my brain trying to go for different options, but in the end I can only present a single option. At that point I'm almost taking responsibility to saying that I'm making that decision for them. And so that's...
Sometimes there is only one choice. and that's fine, as long as, you know, you've noted that. There's nothing wrong with that. So where you've got a really big decision and you're looking at, you know, are we going to build this system, are we going to buy it? You just need to go through a defined process, you know, in the normal way. Make sure that you've got some sort of approval from some sort of control board. There'll be a project control board, and run it as a project, really. Consider things like, is the application a commodity? Because if it's a commodity, it's more likely to be appropriate to buy it. What's the granularity? Buy small components is quite a good thing. One of the examples, one of the organisations I've been working with recently, they're implementing big system, and they've bought 2 packages, neither of which are right for the job they want to do. And now, a year into the project, they've realised that, which is sort of unfortunate, because they've bought applications which are really part of their unique selling point, you know, their unique proposition, and they're trying to tailor the package now to do what they need. Not good.
What is the 80% rule that you mentioned?
Basically, if you're going to use the package out of the box, you know, 80% of the package, just minor tailoring, minor customizations, you know, adopt the process as implemented by the package, then that's probably not unreasonable. However, if you buy a package, I've seen an organisation buy an HR package, which also already had predefined processes for recruitment and salary reviews and all this stuff. However, it was only a small organisation, 500 people. They said, no, we're unique. We need to have unique HR processes, and actually spent 2 years trying to get it to work, which is a bit mad, because they really should have changed their process, because it's not fundamental to what they were trying to sell. It's HR.
So you're saying it should be an 80% fit? Or
80% fit, yes. Sorry if that wasn't clear. But even then, you've gone through all this process, and sometimes senior management will overturn it, because, you know, they're thinking about things from a slightly different perspective. They're thinking about the cultural issues, does it fit? They're thinking about the resourcing profile, will it fit with our people? Politics particularly plays a big part. To make sure you've spoken to your stakeholders. I was involved in a selection project where we did everything right, the team did everything right, made a recommendation. The CEO, looked, when they were starting the presentation, took one look at the recommendation slide and just saw that her face fell. It wasn't the right choice. We should have asked first before we did all the work, because it was never going to be the right thing. Learn from previous mistakes, obviously. Make sure you've considered all the environmental aspects, legal and external factors, and think about your operations department. You've got to live with this going forward. We've talked so much, had so much discussion, we're running out of time. So let's save this for the end. I've only got a few more slides. I like this one. Some of you may have done it before, but I like the Stroop effect. So basically, there's going to be some letters in colours coming up on the screen. Can you please shout out the colours that the text is in?
Red, blue, yellow, green, blue, black, red, yellow, black, blue.
Easy. What's so hard about that? Try it again.
Yellow, red, green. Can't read it.
It's really hard, isn't it? It's excellent. It's an example of cognitive dissonance. It's basically your language skills have to battle with your eyes, with the feedback you're getting from your eyes. And colour's hardwired into our brain. You know, we've been conditioned through evolution to respond to these colours. So colour's a really important thing. So, you know, danger, red for danger, yellow for danger as well. Blue and green, so calm and lovely. It's how we react to things and what we actually think about things aren't always as obvious as you might think. So how do you get sort of this, how does cognitive dissonance and cognitive bias come about in decision making? Really it results in unjustifiable decisions. You're trying to prove yourself right, so you'll ignore conflicting evidence. It's a bit like there's only one option here, or as you said, my preferred view is wonderful. Everything else just creeps in by accident. The other thing that's quite important is recency. The last thing that happened has more weight. If the last project you worked on went horribly wrong in a particular way, you will never want to touch that technology. Now, if it's just happened, we couldn't consider that, even if it was actually the right choice for the new project. Peer pressure and groupthink, you know, how did we, you know, well, feel mostly too young, but you know, those fashions in the 1980s, how on earth could we obviously think they were cool? Personal impact. If you've got an inspirational leader, they may, you know, what they say goes, even if it's an irrational choice. You'll often, if you've got a preferred option, you use selective memory. You'll forget the bad things about that option. So you need to be careful that that doesn't happen. Attribution asymmetry. If it was good, it was my idea. If it was bad, it was your idea. You need to avoid that. And your personal attitude to risk. Sometimes your personal attitude to risk is not the same as the organisational attitude to risk. I tend to be more risk averse than my company in some ways. You know, but I need to be conscious of that, otherwise I appear as a naysayer all the time, which is not a good thing to be. And also black swans. So if you've got a single black swan in 100 white swans, then everybody sees the black swan. So you must make sure that you give equal weight. You know, white swans represent the majority. They actually should be considered more. So once you've made your decision, you need to validate them. And you can use some techniques for validating your decision. I don't know if any of you have come across Owen, who's presenting in the other room, Owen Woods and Nick Rosansky's Software System Architecture's book. They present a set of perspectives which are similar to quality attributes, but they're talking about them as cross-cutting concerns, so performance and scalability, internationalization, you know, security, those sorts of things. And it's worth thinking about those when you've got your decision, just running through those. Does it fit with all these things? It's a good way of making sure you've covered off all the disadvantages and advantages. Make sure you put some real world scenarios through your decision, especially the edge cases, because they're the ones that will trip you up in the future. And make sure you understand the architectural trade-offs of the decisions that you've made. And if you do all those things, if you know why you made the decision, make sure that they're shared and understood. You'll always then be able to answer the question, why on earth did you do that? And like magic, it finished. So that was the end. Any other questions or points you want to make on any of that?
The decisions many of the worst decisions I've made have been when I didn't even realise I was making a decision. Do you have any tips for detecting when that sort of scenarios happen?
So somebody comes and asks you, or are you just, I think it's when you start to see a set of complexities. There's more than one or two people involved. It's going to affect multiple teams. You'll sort of see, oh, I could do it this way, or I could do it that way. Then you start to think, oh, actually, there's a significant decision here. Things that are going to have a cost impact or a time impact on your project. They're the sort of things that lead to decision making. How did you know you should have made a decision afterwards?
Hindsight. You look back and go, actually, there was another option there. Often you're making decisions. The decisions you don't think you're making under the gun.
It's about discussion with your team as well. The other people, you're working with other architects, looking, even, Googling the technology, you'll start to see discussions happening. Oh, do I do this, or should I use that? It's about communication and listening to other people in who's had those experiences, I think. So, okay. Thank you very much. It's been